A very good morning to all of you. Today, in this lecture, we will try to understand about the inguinal canal. The very first thing which comes in our mind is why the inguinal canal is needed in our body. And there is two reasons. So, very first reason is that the inguinal canal allow the content of the scrotum to communicate with the intra-abdominal contents. Means the spermatic cord is connected with the other structures of the intra-abdominal cavity. So it provides a passage. And the second reason is it prevents the mobile intra-abdominal content such as the intestine from entering into the scrotum. So it also acts as a barrier, and through this barrier the intra-abdominal content do not get entered into the scrotum. While at the very same time, this inguinal canal permits the blood vessels, nerves, lymphatics, vas deferens, etc. to supply the scrotal content. So this is the very basic two reasons why the inguinal canal is needed in our body. Now come to understand the shape of the inguinal canal. This is a very basic shape of the inguinal canal, and this is represented as a box. So the inguinal canal is somehow like a box. As you can see here in this diagram, this is a box, and this box is showing the four walls. The front facing wall of this box presented as an anterior wall of the inguinal canal. This is the roof. The superior wall is of course said to be as a roof, and the posterior wall opposite to the anterior wall, and the floor one. So this four-sided box represents the shape of a inguinal canal, and you can see here this box is tilted downward on the right side. Means this box represents the inguinal canal of the right side, means the medial end is downward and lateral end is slightly upward. So this is the diagrammatic representation of the inguinal canal. And here the arrow indicates that the structure can run through this inguinal canal from the lateral side to the medial side, and the space inside the box is said to be as an inguinal canal, and through this space the spermatic cords in males and the round ligament of uterus in female passes. The inguinal canal can be represented as a box in a very simple way. Now here in this diagram, the anterior wall and the roof of the box has been removed so that the posterior wall can be easily visualized. You can clearly see this is the posterior wall. The yellow colored area is showing the posterior wall, and of course this gray colored part is showing the floor of the inguinal canal. Here in the posterior wall there is an opening, the oval shape opening, and this oval shape opening in the posterior wall is called as the deep inguinal ring, and this is the floor. In this next diagram, all the four walls of the box is intact. This is the anterior wall, the roof, the posterior wall, and of course the floor. Here you can see this anterior wall has another opening, and this opening in the anterior wall is called as the superficial inguinal ring. So you can very clearly see the superficial inguinal ring is present into the anterior wall, whereas the deep inguinal ring was present into the posterior wall. Now in this diagram, you can see the content of this inguinal canal, that is the spermatic cord in males, entered through this deep inguinal ring which is present into the posterior wall. So this opening into the posterior wall is deep inguinal ring, and it provides the entry of the spermatic cord in males. And when the spermatic cords get entered and comes into this space, it runs downward, forward and medially and reaches near the superficial inguinal ring which is present into the anterior wall, and then it emerges out from the superficial inguinal ring. So we can very clearly understand by this image the content of the inguinal canal enters through the deep inguinal ring which is present into the posterior wall, runs along the entire length of the canal, reaches near the superficial inguinal ring which is present into the anterior wall, and then emerge out from the superficial inguinal ring. In this image, the roof has been removed out so that we can clearly see the entry and exit of the spermatic cord. Here the interior wall can be clearly seen, and this opening present into the anterior wall near the medial end is the superficial inguinal ring. The anterior wall is made up of the external oblique muscle throughout its length, and near the lateral end of the anterior wall, this anterior wall is reinforced by the internal oblique muscle. So lateral end of the anterior wall is being reinforced by the internal oblique muscle and some part of the transversus abdominis muscle. So the entire length of this anterior wall is made up of the external oblique, and on the lateral side this anterior wall is reinforced by the internal oblique and the transversus abdominis muscle. Here the roof of the inguinal canal is showing. So the roof of the inguinal canal is formed by the conjoint tendon, and the conjoint tendon is attached to the pubic crest on the medial side. So this is the medial end of the conjoint tendon, and here the conjoint tendon is being attached with the pubic crest, and it reinforces the posterior wall on the medial side also. So this is the posterior wall, and the posterior wall is being reinforced by the conjoint tendon, and this conjoint tendon also forms the roof of the inguinal canal. So the entire roof is being formed by the conjoint tendon, and when the conjoint tendon comes near the medial end, it gets attached with the posterior wall, and finally it reinforces the posterior wall. The conjoint tendon is formed by the transversus abdominis and internal oblique muscles, and it arches over the content of the inguinal canal. As you can see here, it is arching over the inguinal canal and ultimately forming the roof of this inguinal canal. Here the posterior wall is showing, rest of the part of the canal is removed. The entire length of posterior wall is formed by the transversalis fascia, which is showing here, and the conjoint tendon is attached on the medial end of this posterior wall, and finally it reinforcing the posterior wall. Here you can clearly see on the lateral end of the posterior wall, this is an oval opening called as the deep inguinal ring. So the posterior wall near the deep inguinal ring is weaker because here no other structure is present to reinforce the posterior wall. Only the transversalis fascia is present. In this diagram, only the floor is showing, and the floor is formed by the curvatures of the inguinal ligament. And this curvature is a part of the external oblique muscles, which is forming a gutter-like shape. Medially, it forms the lacunar ligament, which is not illustrated here. So this is the floor, and the floor is formed by the inguinal ligament. Here in this image, the roof and the anterior wall is showing. The anterior wall is formed by the external oblique muscle. On the medial end of anterior wall, there is opening. This opening is called as the superficial inguinal ring. On the lateral side of the anterior wall, there is another muscles present here to reinforce this anterior wall, and this is the internal oblique muscle. So the anterior wall is weaker medially because the hole in the external oblique muscle is present on the medial side, and here no other structure is present to reinforce this anterior wall. So the anterior wall is weaker medially. The roof is formed by the conjoint tendon and the meeting of the anterior and posterior wall of the canal. So the roof is mainly formed by the conjoint tendon, and that conjoint tendon is arching over this canal. Now come to some clinical aspect of this inguinal canal. In the case of the hernia, the posterior wall of the canal is particularly weak laterally because of the deep inguinal ring. As you can see here in this diagram, this is the posterior wall, and the posterior wall is weaker near the deep inguinal ring, which is situated laterally. But the anterior wall opposite to the deep inguinal ring is reinforced laterally by the presence of the internal oblique muscle. So this is the internal oblique muscle which is reinforcing the anterior wall laterally. A hernia that comes through the deep inguinal ring will have to travel along the inguinal canal. So in the case of hernia, the abdominal content comes through the deep inguinal ring, reaches into this canal, inguinal canal, and it travels through the inguinal canal as it cannot push into the reinforced layer of the muscle of the anterior. So in the case of hernia, the content comes through the deep inguinal ring, but that content cannot push the anterior wall. So it travels through the canal and reaches near the superficial inguinal ring and comes out from the superficial inguinal ring. Here the anterior wall is reinforced laterally. That's why this anterior wall cannot be pushed directly. But the anterior wall of the canal is weaker medially, where the superficial inguinal ring is present. Here this is the location of superficial inguinal ring into the anterior wall, and this area near the superficial inguinal ring is weaker. But the posterior wall opposite to the superficial inguinal ring is reinforced medially by the conjoint tendon. This red colored part is showing the area of the conjoint tendon, which is formed by the fibers of the internal oblique and transversus abdominis muscle. And the abdominal content cannot normally force themselves through this superficial ring directly because of the reinforced posterior wall medially. So this arrow is showing the intra-abdominal pressure, and when the intra-abdominal pressure increases, it cannot push the posterior wall medially because the posterior wall medially is reinforced by this conjoint tendon. Here in this diagram, the pressure on the inguinal canal is showing, and this green color part is showing the area where the reinforcement is present. So in the anterior wall, the reinforcement is present on the lateral side, but in the posterior wall, the reinforcement is present on the medial side. So when the intra-abdominal pressure increases, the posterior wall cannot be pushed medially due to the presence of this conjoint tendon, and the very same way, the anterior wall cannot be pushed laterally due to the presence of this reinforcement laterally on the anterior wall. And if any weakness occurs medially into the posterior wall, it will lead to the direct inguinal hernia, means the abdominal content comes directly into this inguinal canal through this weaker point of the posterior abdominal wall, and that will lead to the direct inguinal hernia, as you can see here.